Hello, this is a video to help clear up some confusion about chord scales versus source scales and how we choose default and optional chord scales. Okay, the first thing to be aware of is that in the case of any chord, there's always more than one choice because there's always more than one scale where that chord can be found. So the first type of choice is the default choice. This is the most common choice, the one that if you were to survey thousands of pieces of music, you would find in the vast majority of the cases, the composer or songwriter is using the default chord scale in their composition. The second category is the optional chord scale or scales. Sometimes there's more than one optional chord scale. And those are the scales that are a little more outside the box. They are going to be a little bit less common, or maybe a great deal less common. And the reason they are less common is because they are supporting the chord function in less obvious of a way. So let me show you what I mean by that. So let's take a really typical chord, a major chord scale. Now, you may know that chord scales are named with modal names, and they go in order. And so Ionian is equivalent to a major scale, and then Dorian is equivalent to the second mode of a major scale. In other words, a major scale starting on its second note. And Phrygian is equivalent to a major scale starting on its third note, and so on. Okay, well, here we are in the key of A major. We have an A major chord, and the most obvious chord scale to use is A major. So I'm going to write an A major chord scale here. What are we trying to do with the chord scale? We're using the chord scale as source material to write a melody, to maybe arrange voicings, etc. And we've gone out of our way to create one major chord, and so we want our surrounding notes to support that sound in the key. We want it to sound like one. We don't want it to sound like, say, for example, the 4 major 7 chord. We don't want it to sound like a modal interchange chord. So doesn't it make sense that in order to make it sound like one, we're going to use the A major chord scale? That's going to help our ear hear it as a 1 chord. Now, in this video, I'm not spending a lot of time explaining why certain notes are available tensions and why certain notes are avoid notes. That would be for a different video. But the basic reason is that chords are labeled as available tensions when they blend in with the chord function well. They blend with the chord sound and they support the chord function. And notes which do not do that, which conflict with the chord function and sound dissonant or in some way distract from the sound that we were trying to achieve, those would be harmonic avoid notes. The general rule for non-dominant chords is that when written out as a chord scale, if a non-chord tone is a whole step above a chord tone below it, it's going to blend with the chord sound and it would be an available tension, and we will label it by its compound interval name, T9, not T2, T9. If the note is a half step above a chord tone below it, it's going to be too dissonant for that chord function, and we will label it S, as in the scale, available in the scale, not in the chord, and with the small number name S4. Now, this general rule applies to all non-dominant chords. Dominant chords are different. Okay, so this is the reason that Ionian is the default chord scale for 1 major 7, is because it's entirely diatonic to the key of A major, in which A major is the 1 chord. And therefore, when you hear these notes against an A major 7 chord, your brain is going to say, oh, that's the 1 chord. Okay. However, there is an optional chord scale for this chord, because think about it, there's more than one place you can get a major 7 chord. A major 7 chord is also the 4 chord in every major key. So we could apply a Lydian chord scale to this chord, and that would be an optional chord scale. Obviously, the most common choice is going to be Ionian, but we could theoretically change this to a D sharp and change the way it's labeled so it's no longer labeled as an avoid note. And in case it would now become a whole step above the chord tone below it, and it would become an available tension, and it would become T sharp 11. And that would totally work against an A major 7 chord, but in the context of that chord being a 1 major 7, it would make this sound less like the 1 chord. All right? So the reason that Ionian is going to be the default chord scale for 1 major 7, is because A Ionian is going to be the chord scale that would make this chord sound most like a 1 chord and not like a 4 chord or a modal interchange chord. All right, so I repeat, every chord has more than one choice, but we learn the default choices first because they're most common, and once we're cool with them, then we move on to learning optional choices. The reason one chord scale is more common is probably because it works better most of the time. Every chord has a default chord scale, and every chord has more possibilities, which would be optional choices. All right, let's take a look at a secondary dominant. Let's just do our typical secondary dominant chord scale first. So the typical way that we deal with secondary dominants is that we try to use as many diatonic notes as possible because they are going to support the key, and that's what the secondary dominant is doing. It's trying to lead us back into the key very strongly and target another diatonic chord, in this case the 2 chord. So it makes sense if our goal is to really keep the listener's ear in the key and not distract them from the key too much. We're going to want to use as many diatonic notes as possible, right? We start with our chord tones, of course. F sharp is the 1. A sharp is the 3rd of the chord, so we must use an accidental there, right? That's the 3rd of the chord. C sharp is the 5th. We've already got that. It's a diatonic note. And E is the flat 7. That's a diatonic note. So we only had to make one chromatic alteration to get our chord tones into the chord scale. Now our remaining notes, we retain them as diatonic. This is our default way of dealing with secondary dominants. So that note is a G sharp, so we keep it. This note is a B, so we keep it. It's diatonic. This note is a D, we keep it. It's diatonic. That's our default setting for secondary dominants. Now when we label this, we get 1, T9, 3, of course, S4, that's our harmonic avoid note when it's the 4th scale degree on a dominant chord. 5, flat 13, because it's a minor 6th above the root, and it's an available tension because in dominant chords we can have notes which are a half step above a chord tone because they are dissonant notes, but that's okay because dominant chords are dissonant sounds. This is meant to be a transitional chord, and this is an arrival chord. Okay, so that's why it's okay to have dissonant tensions like flat 13. So again, what do? Our priority is to be as diatonic as possible, so we retain as many diatonic notes as possible, but of course we still make sure that we have our chord tones, which may require chromaticism. So what chord scale do we end up with? We end up with a chord scale that is very similar to a mixo chord scale, except it has a flat 13. So we label that as mixo flat 13. That's the default chord scale. However, we always know there's more than one optional chord scale as well. So say the songwriter decides, I want a more dissonant sound here. I want a flat 9. So look at this passage here. Well, look, there it is. Right there in the voicing is a G natural. That is not diatonic to A, right? So the composer, the songwriter, is making a choice. They are saying, yeah, this is not the most diatonic choice, but I, as the artist, want this sound. Like a painter deciding to paint something a different color. The sky is usually blue, but you can paint it red if you want. You can paint it green if you want. That's artistic license, right? So this is an example of the use of an optional chord scale, an optional sound. So in that case, we would have to alter our chord scale. We would change our chord scale. Now, anytime a dominant chord has a flat 9, which is what this is, the implication is that it would also have a sharp 9. And you'll notice the sharp 9 is actually diatonic. It's an A natural. Technically, it's a G double sharp, but we're going to call it an A natural. That's their sharp 9. And that is available. It's diatonic, so it's always going to be included. So anytime you have a dominant chord scale with a flat 9, you are always going to have a sharp 9 available as well. And so what have we done? We have created optional chord scale for this chord. 5/7 of 2 is usually mixo flat 13, but now in this case, because of the artistic choice made by the composer or arranger or player, it is a different chord scale, and it's now mixo flat 9, sharp 9, flat 13. Again, dissonance is fine on dominant chords, but the reason we don't use this note is we don't want to include our target chord root in the chord voicing because it makes the chord less effective. All right, so I've given you two examples of optional chord scales. The original chord scale is going to prioritize something. This original chord scale is prioritizing that it's diatonic. It supports the chord function. This original chord scale is prioritizing diatonic notes as well because that will support the key. But this is totally available as another choice. This is going to give you a little more dissonance, a more outside the key sound than that, but sometimes we want to do that, just the way an artist may decide to paint the sky a different color other than blue because they are trying to make a different kind of statement. I'm going to end the video here, but I encourage you to watch part 2, which is about default and optional chord scales as they relate to modal interchange chords. Okay, so check out part 2 as well.